On April 15, 1943, at roughly 25,000 feet above the Belgian shoreline, Oberleutnant Herman Keller of Jagdgeschwader 26 spotted several shapes moving in from the west. Their contours were unfamiliar, large, single-engined fighters that matched nothing in the aircraft identification guides issued to German units. According to the combat report he later filed, now stored in the Bundesarchives wartime collection, this was the first moment frontline Luftwaffe pilots came face-to-face with the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt in actual combat. The American aircraft were flying higher than Keller believed their fighters could realistically operate, holding formation above 7 kilometers as if altitude were no obstacle at all. What happened in the next moments would leave a deep impression on German aviators for the rest of the conflict. The lead American machine suddenly lit up with an unbroken stream of muzzle flashes, far more sustained and concentrated than the short, staggered bursts of 4 or 6 guns the Luftwaffe was used to seeing. Instead, 8 heavy-caliber weapons fired in tight synchronization, producing a dense, converging storm of rounds that had no precedent in German aerial tactics. Keller watched his wingman's Focke-Wulf 190 absorb dozens of hits in barely 2 seconds. There was no dramatic fireball, no drawn-out dive. The fighter simply disintegrated, shredded into fragments by a wave of .50 caliber armor-piercing incendiary rounds. The American pilot responsible was Major Donald Blakesley of the 4th Fighter Group, and this engagement marked the very first aerial victory achieved by a P-47. For the Luftwaffe, it was also the moment they first encountered the United States' radically different approach to air combat firepower. The P-47C Thunderbolt carried 8 Browning M2 heavy machine guns, each capable of firing around 800 rounds per minute. Combined, the armament produced a blistering rate of roughly 6,400 rounds per minute, more than 100 bullets every second. With 350 cartridges allocated to each gun, a Thunderbolt pilot could sustain this destructive output for over half a minute of total trigger time, an endurance unheard of in earlier stages of the war. The arithmetic of aerial engagements had taken a dramatic turn. This sudden shock stemmed from a collision of 2 contrasting design philosophies. The Luftwaffe entered the war convinced that cannons, not machine guns, represented the future of fighter armament. Their standard weapon, the 20mm MG-151-20, fired explosive shells that could cripple or destroy an enemy aircraft with only a few solid hits. Because of this, German training emphasized marksmanship and deflection shooting, placing a small number of shells precisely where they mattered most. In a post-war interview, Major Günther Röhl, who would ultimately become the 3rd highest-scoring fighter ace with 275 aerial victories, summed up the German mindset succinctly. The Luftwaffe regarded rifle caliber and even heavy machine guns as relics of an earlier era, while cannon weaponry was seen as the natural progression of air combat development.
A highly trained fighter pilot could, in theory, win a battle with nothing more than perfectly placed bursts of gunfire. In practice, however, the Americans adopted a completely different philosophy of aerial warfare. Instead of relying on the sharpshooter abilities of individual pilots to land pinpoint hits, the P-47 Thunderbolt was designed to unleash such a dense stream of bullets that accuracy became almost irrelevant. With 8 .50 caliber machine guns firing in harmonized convergence, the aircraft projected a wide, lethal curtain of fire. At common engagement distances, roughly 200 to 300 yards, the overlapping trajectories produced a kill zone roughly 8 feet high and 12 feet across, a space in which any enemy machine was virtually guaranteed to be shredded. Colonel Robert S. Johnson of the famed 56th Fighter Group, who finished the war with 27 victories in P-47s, later summarized this approach in plain terms. American fighters weren't attempting delicate, surgeon-like shots. Their doctrine was to release such overwhelming volume that destruction became the default outcome whenever the trigger was held down. Numbers from the period illustrate just how different the American and German concepts of firepower really were. A single P-47 typically left the airfield carrying 2,800 rounds, 350 for each of its 8 guns. Every armor-piercing incendiary bullet weighed a little under 2 ounces. In a brief 15-second burst, the Thunderbolt could pour more than 1,600 rounds toward a target, amounting to roughly 171 pounds of metal mixed with incendiary compounds. German fighters, by contrast, were far more limited. The Bf-109G carried only 150 shells for its centerline 20mm cannon, and its two 13mm machine guns held barely 300 rounds apiece. This meant that a German pilot had perhaps 6 or 7 seconds of cannon fire available before his primary weapon ran dry, making sustained attacks extremely difficult. A P-47, meanwhile, could execute several long firing passes during a single engagement and still have ammunition left for additional confrontations. The type's first encounter with the Luftwaffe actually arrived earlier than many pilots later remembered. On March 10, 1943, the 4th Fighter Group took the Thunderbolt into combat for the very first time on a mission over France. Ironically, the debut was a complete disappointment. A widespread radio failure forced the entire formation to return to base without engaging anyone. German units thus accidentally avoided an encounter with a machine they had not yet realized would soon dominate high-altitude fighting. One factor they had not accounted for was that the P-47 had been engineered specifically to excel in the thin air where American heavy bombers operated. Its massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp engine, paired with a remarkably advanced turbo supercharger installation, was capable of delivering about 2,300 horsepower even at altitudes where German power plants began to falter. Around 25,000 feet, near the standard altitude for B-17 formations, the Thunderbolt retained speed, climb, and maneuvering capability that German fighters simply could not match. The Luftwaffe doctrine had long focused on combat below 20,000 feet, a band in which their aircraft performed best. The Daimler-Benz DB605 engine of the Bf-109G, even when boosted with MW50 water methanol injection, lost significant power as it climbed into very high altitude. The Focke-Wulf FW-190A, extremely dangerous closer to the ground, became heavy and unresponsive as it approached 22,000 feet. Major Egon Meyer of JG-2, well known for refining the head-on attack against American bomber formations, openly acknowledged this problem in his assessments. At altitudes above roughly 7,500 meters, he noted, the balance tilted sharply in favor of the Thunderbolts. They retained smooth control authority, while German fighters felt stiff and sluggish, allowing the American aircraft to swoop down from superior height, fire massive bursts, and climb away again before an effective counterattack could be mounted.
By the middle of 1943, another shock awaited German intelligence: the sheer industrial output behind the P-47 program. When accurate reports finally reached Berlin, the scale of American production seemed almost impossible. Republic Aviation's main plant at Farmingdale, supplemented by a rapidly expanding facility in Evansville, Indiana, began turning out Thunderbolts at a rate that dwarfed German expectations. At peak efficiency, the combined factories produced roughly 840 aircraft each month, about 28 fighters every single day. The Evansville line alone would eventually manufacture more than 6,200 P-47s, a figure unimaginable to a German industry under increasing strain from resource shortages and Allied bombing. By late 1944, German aircraft manufacturing reached its absolute high point. In September alone, factories across the Reich delivered roughly 2,177 fighters of all models combined. This output, spread across multiple airframes and divided among numerous production lines, contrasted sharply with what was happening across the Atlantic. A single American manufacturer, Republic Aviation, was turning out such a massive stream of P-47 Thunderbolts that its production totals amounted to nearly half of Germany's entire fighter output during the same period. One U.S. company, focused on a single airframe, was approaching the industrial capacity of an entire nation at war.
When first confronted with intelligence summaries describing this scale of American manufacturing, Joseph Pips Priller, Group Commodore of JG-26, reportedly dismissed them as defeatist exaggerations. Yet, as 1943 progressed and the presence of ever-growing Thunderbolt groups became impossible to ignore, he retrieved those same intelligence reports and annotated them with grim commentary. His conclusion was blunt. Even these alarming numbers understated the industrial gap. The Luftwaffe, he realized, was being drawn into a form of industrialized conflict far beyond anything it had anticipated. The disparity was not only numerical. The P-47 itself represented the kind of mass-engineered system the U.S. excelled at producing. More than 17,000 individual components went into each aircraft, all brought together through streamlined assembly methods optimized for scale. The 8 Browning M2 heavy machine guns mounted in the wings, an armament package heavier and more expensive than the entire airframe of many German fighters, symbolized this American abundance. Despite such complexity and cost, the United States ultimately produced 15,686 Thunderbolts, placing it among the most numerous American combat aircraft of the war. Thunderbolt capabilities were demonstrated dramatically on August 17, 1943, during the first Schweinfurt raid. For the first time, P-47s used belly fuel tanks to accompany B-17s deep into German airspace, extending their reach far beyond previous limits. Squadrons of JG-1 and JG-26, expecting vulnerable bombers once the usual escort range had been reached, instead encountered 240 Thunderbolts maintaining a tight protective screen. The clash that followed gave German pilots their first extended exposure to the P-47's immense firepower. Hans Wilhelm Galland of JG-26 later summarized the shock. The Thunderbolt's gun batteries did not merely cripple aircraft, they obliterated them. Pilots with thousands of hours of experience vanished in bursts of debris before having any chance to escape. Encounters that once allowed for controlled disengagement had become instantaneous, lethal events.
The psychological effect on Luftwaffe fighter units was profound. Tactics carefully refined through years of combat against Allied aircraft suddenly seemed obsolete. Against the Thunderbolt's volume of fire, American pilots could rely less on maneuvering and more on overwhelming fire saturation. Precision dogfighting gave way to a form of aerial combat defined by raw, destructive power. P-47 units rapidly built strategies around the aircraft's strengths. Chief among them was the high-altitude diving attack. Beginning at altitudes around 30,000 feet, Thunderbolts would plunge toward enemy formations at speeds close to 500 miles per hour, release a dense burst of fire, and then use the carried-over energy to arc back upward. German pilots referred to these attacks as death from above, recognizing that there was virtually no countermeasure. In terms of energy, physics overwhelmingly favored the American aircraft. A Thunderbolt dropping from 30,000 to 15,000 feet accumulated enough speed to climb back to roughly 25,000 feet without requiring full engine power. German fighters, operating near the limits of their altitude performance, were disadvantaged in this vertical style of combat. The Thunderbolt's weight, long seen as its greatest flaw, became its most fearsome attribute in a dive. At more than 7 tons fully loaded, the aircraft picked up speed faster than any German fighter could safely achieve. Luftwaffe pilots attempting to escape downward found Thunderbolts not only keeping pace, but closing rapidly, delivering destructive bursts during the chase. An equally important imbalance lay in ammunition capacity. Each P-47 carried 350 rounds per gun, giving pilots extraordinary freedom in firing tactics. They could bracket targets with exploratory bursts, adjust their aim, and still have enough ammunition to engage multiple opponents in a single sortie. German pilots, by contrast, typically carried only 150 to 200 rounds for their main cannon.
Ammunition conservation was therefore a constant concern. Every pull of the trigger required careful thought. Missing a target meant wasting irreplaceable munitions, and potentially forfeiting the engagement. This asymmetry introduced a psychological divide as stark as the industrial one behind it. American pilots fought with the confidence that resources were plentiful. German pilots fought knowing that every round mattered. Behind the scenes, U.S. production capacity rendered this disparity almost inevitable. The Lake City Ordnance Plant in Missouri alone manufactured approximately 6.5 billion rounds of .50 caliber ammunition during the war. To put this in perspective, this single facility could have supplied every Thunderbolt ever built with more than 400,000 rounds, over 140 complete ammunition loads per aircraft. The Luftwaffe, constrained by shrinking supply chains and strained industrial capacity, had no comparable reserve.
The air war over Europe thus became more than a contest of machines and pilots. It was a contest of entire economies. The Thunderbolt, with its mass, firepower, and sheer abundance, embodied the industrial might that increasingly defined the conflict's outcome. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, the P-47 Thunderbolt delivered one of the clearest proofs of its overwhelming superiority in the European air war. While Germany's Luftwaffe managed to send barely more than 300 sorties across the Normandy region during the entire 24 hours, the U.S. 9th Air Force alone launched over 2,000 missions with P-47s. For German aviators racing toward the invasion zone, the scene that greeted them was nothing short of hopeless. Dense layers of American fighters stretched across the sky in every direction. The numerical imbalance was staggering. Luftwaffe pilots often found themselves outnumbered 20-1 before the first maneuver had even begun. And even when they gathered the courage to engage, they faced American aircraft whose concentrated fire made close-quarters dogfighting essentially suicidal. By nightfall, the Luftwaffe had lost 35 aircraft. Pilots flying the P-47 claimed responsibility for 27 of them. The Thunderbolt's impact on the ground war was equally unsettling for German forces trying to reinforce Normandy. Equipped with rockets and bombs, P-47s shredded troop columns and armored units attempting to move toward the front. But the weapon that generated the greatest fear was not the heavy ordnance, it was the .850 caliber machine guns. A single strafing run from one Thunderbolt could tear apart a convoy, punching through armor plates, destroying engines, and incapacitating crews with astonishing speed. By the final months of 1944, the Luftwaffe was dealing with a crisis that went far beyond hardware. New pilots were arriving at frontline units with scarcely 10 hours of time in fighter aircraft, and they were being thrown directly into battles against Americans who often had hundreds of combat hours behind them. This extreme training deficit, combined with the technological gap, meant that many engagements were closer to executions than actual dogfights. Replacement pilots, rushed into service with minimal preparation, were especially vulnerable to the Thunderbolt's dense wall of gunfire. Accuracy mattered less when 8 heavy guns could saturate a wide swath of airspace. Veteran Luftwaffe instructors later recalled that some entire training cohorts were wiped out during their very first encounters with P-47s. Statistical records confirmed the scale of the disaster. German pilots who began training after June 1944 had less than 15% chance of surviving even 5 missions. When facing P-47 specifically, their odds fell into the single digits.
As casualties mounted, entire squadrons disappeared in one-sided clashes, quickly replaced by even less experienced flyers, whose survival time was even shorter. This collapse was illustrated dramatically during Operation Bodenplatte, the Luftwaffe's New Year's Day strike on Allied airfields on January 1, 1945. Although the attack achieved momentary surprise and destroyed numerous aircraft on the ground, the withdrawal turned into a catastrophe. Intercepted by alert Allied units, German losses were so severe that the operation came to symbolize the final, irreversible shift in air superiority. As the German fighters concluded their low-level attacks and attempted to withdraw, they flew straight into successive formations of P-47 Thunderbolts, launched from airfields farther behind the lines. Lacking both the height advantage and the ammunition reserves needed for a prolonged engagement, the Luftwaffe aircraft were cut apart in a series of short, decisive clashes. Units of the 365th Fighter Group rushing into the air from Metz in the immediate aftermath of the initial assault intercepted German formations still skimming close to the ground. In several encounters, entire groups of enemy fighters were wiped out before they could climb or reorganize. By the end of the operation, the Luftwaffe had suffered catastrophic losses: 271 aircraft destroyed and 143 pilots killed, numbers so severe that the organization would never truly recover its former strength. American losses in air combat amounted to only 16 aircraft. The disparity in casualties represented one of the most lopsided exchange ratios ever recorded in aerial warfare and illustrated how thoroughly American firepower doctrine dominated the skies. Even the late-war deployment of the Me-262 jet fighter, a source of brief optimism for Germany, did little to alter the trend. Though the jet could outrun the lumbering Thunderbolt in level flight, its vulnerability during takeoff and landing turned speed into an irrelevant advantage. P-47 pilots quickly adapted their tactics, patrolling near known jet bases and striking when Me-262s were slow, low, and unable to maneuver, often with landing gear or flaps still extended. The 850 caliber Browning guns mounted on each Thunderbolt produced such dense fire that a jet, once targeted, could be torn apart as easily as a piston-engine fighter. A number of Germany's irreplaceable jet aviators were lost in these ambushes. Walter Novotny, however, was not among those downed by P-47s. Contrary to some later claims, he was shot down by P-51 Mustangs on November 8, 1944.
Industrial output told an even clearer story of the imbalance. Republic Aviation ultimately built 15,686 P-47s during the war, with peak monthly production reaching an astonishing 840 aircraft. Outfitting each airframe required 8 Browning M2 machine guns, meaning more than 125,000 guns were produced specifically for the Thunderbolt fleet alone. American industry also manufactured over 12 billion rounds of .50 caliber ammunition, a volume so immense that P-47 units effectively never faced ammunition shortages. In contrast, Germany's total fighter production from 1939 to 1945 amounted to roughly 33,000 aircraft of all types. By the later stages of the conflict, persistent shortages of ammunition forced many Luftwaffe pilots to fly with incomplete loads, and dwindling fuel reserves restricted flight time to barely 15 or 20 minutes per mission. Meanwhile, P-47s routinely operated with enough fuel for 2 hours of combat, allowing them to dictate the terms of engagement from start to finish. The psychological pressure accumulating among German pilots gradually reached the level of a shared trauma. Luftwaffe medical personnel recorded what they termed Thunderbolt neurosis, a condition in which even faint noises resembling the synchronized roar of 8.50 caliber machine guns triggered involuntary fear reactions. Airmen who had repeatedly encountered P-47 Thunderbolts often displayed symptoms closely resembling those seen in soldiers suffering from artillery shock. As the war progressed, veteran flyers developed increasingly elaborate ways to avoid direct combat, adopting behaviors centered not on achieving aerial superiority, but simply on staying alive. They sought out only stragglers or damaged aircraft, avoided fighting at altitudes above 20,000 feet, where the P-47 held a clear performance edge, refused head-on engagements with the American fighters' concentrated firepower, and broke off instantly whenever Thunderbolts appeared in the vicinity. These were not tactics designed to win battles, they were defensive rituals born out of fear. Major Georg Rahl, who survived the conflict with 275 credited victories, later offered valuable testimony about confronting the P-47. On 12 May 1944, he lost his left thumb during an attack by Thunderbolts from the 56th Fighter Group, commanded at the time by Hubert or Hub Zemke. Reflecting on these encounters after the war, Rahl explained, "The P-47 held its speed better at high altitude and could drop into a dive faster than the Bf-109. We came to fear not only the aircraft itself, but the entire philosophy behind its firepower." General-Lieutenant Adolf Galland, credited with 104 victories, described the psychological dimension in his memoirs. To him, the 8 heavy machine guns of the P-47 symbolized a uniquely American approach to warfare, one that relied not on precision or economy, but on overwhelming abundance. Every burst of fire seemed to declare, "We possess more than enough, and we can expend it freely to destroy you." Galland believed this impression inflicted damage beyond what the guns physically achieved.
Johannes Steinhoff, future NATO commander and an ace with 176 victories, left no specific written reflections on the P-47, but his extensive service with JG-26, JG-77, and later JG-7 placed him in constant contact with Allied air power. His operational background alone suggests a deep awareness of the scale and doctrine behind American aerial firepower. The trauma extended far beyond the fighter pilots. German ground troops, who had already endured years of brutal warfare on the Eastern Front, found themselves shaken by the P-47's devastating ground attack capability. The same 8 guns that dismembered aircraft proved lethally effective against vehicles, transport columns, railways, and massed troops. A single Thunderbolt could cripple a locomotive in one strafing run, its concentrated fire punching through boiler plating that might deflect cannon shells. Units caught out in the open were often reduced to burning debris scattered across long stretches of road. By the opening months of 1945, new versions of the aircraft, particularly the P-47M and P-47N, expanded an already decisive technological lead. The P-47M, fitted with the Pratt & Whitney R2857C engine and equipped with water injection, pushed out roughly 2,800 horsepower and was capable of speeds exceeding 470 miles per hour. To German forces, already overwhelmed, these late-war variants represented the widening of a gap that could no longer be closed. Only a small production run of 130 P-47s emerged in the final stages of the war, yet these late variants marked the absolute peak of piston-driven fighter evolution. By the time they entered service, they carried the K-14 computing gun sight, a device that effectively erased the Luftwaffe's last domain of superiority, mastery of deflection shooting. Instead of relying on instinct and training to gauge where to fire, the gun sight calculated the necessary lead automatically, using input on distance and relative motion. Paired with the aircraft's battery of 8.50 caliber Browning guns, this system turned even inexperienced American pilots into highly effective attackers. The timing of this technological leap coincided with a crisis inside Germany. By the latter half of 1944, the Reich's aviation fuel reserves had collapsed. The consequences were disastrous on multiple levels. While U.S. pilots continued to log extensive training and operational hours, many newly assigned German flyers were allowed only the bare minimum of flight time. When these undertrained Luftwaffe recruits met seasoned American pilots equipped with sophisticated gun sights and abundant fuel, the resulting encounters were scarcely recognizable as traditional air combat. German pilots often entered missions with no certainty they had enough fuel even for a brief engagement, let alone a prolonged fight. Their American counterparts, flying aircraft with ample reserves, could climb, reposition, disengage, and re-engage as they pleased. This imbalance ensured that the initiative almost always rested with the P-47 formations. German units forced into defensive patterns struggled simply to survive, while American fighters dictated the tempo from start to finish.
By war's end, the operational record of the P-47 in Europe was unambiguous. JUG pilots were officially credited with 3,752 aerial victories. Their destructive power on the ground reached industrial proportions. Roughly 86,000 railway cars damaged or destroyed, 9,000 locomotives eliminated, 68,000 motor vehicles struck, and some 6,000 armored vehicles claimed. These achievements came at a cost of approximately 3,499 Thunderbolts lost from all causes. 1,020 to enemy fighters, the rest mostly to anti-aircraft fire and operational mishaps. In the air, the fighters' kill ratio exceeded 4-to-1, a statistical reflection of the overwhelming advantage it held. The psychological imprint left by the P-47 became evident long after the fighting stopped. During the Korean War, when West German military advisors were invited to review NATO training material, some former Luftwaffe pilots showed clear stress reactions when watching gun camera footage of F-84 Thunderjets attacking ground targets. Their responses underscored how deeply the Thunderbolts' ferocious ground attack reputation had marked wartime survivors. These German advisors repeatedly stressed to NATO strategists that the United States had waged air war according to an industrial doctrine, rather than a dueling philosophy. Massive firepower, not delicate marksmanship. They warned that any future adversary needed to understand that the American approach had never been about fairness, but about overwhelming destruction. In its final operational review in April 1945, the shattered Luftwaffe acknowledged that its traditional model of fighter combat, based on agility, individual experience, and tactical finesse, had been rendered obsolete by the brute weight of U.S. industrial capability. The 8 Browning guns on the P-47 had not only downed German aircraft, they had dismantled an entire belief system. Pilots who had entered the conflict convinced that air war was still defined by personal skill left it recognizing that victory now belonged to nations capable of mass-producing firepower and deploying it without restraint. Post-war military historians echoed this conclusion. They frequently described the P-47's armament as more than a set of guns. It was an expression of the American manufacturing worldview applied directly to the sky. Where German designers pursued elegant efficiency, the United States opted for relentless volume. As Dr. Williamson Murray observed, the P-47 effectively opened air combat to the average pilot, reducing the advantage once held by highly seasoned aces. Even Luftwaffe veterans with extensive combat records found themselves vulnerable when confronted with dense streams of .50 caliber rounds that left little room for evasive skill. The psychological consequences of America's air power did not stop at the level of individual Luftwaffe pilots. They seeped into the broader mindset of the German High Command. Germany had once been the champion of coordinated mechanized warfare, but the overwhelming industrial output behind American aircraft, best embodied by the P-47 and its massive firepower, made it painfully clear that tactical originality could not match a nation capable of producing weapons on a scale the Germans could not hope to equal.
The manufacturing history of the P-47 alone illustrates the magnitude of U.S. wartime mobilization. Republic Aviation, a modest firm turning out fewer than 40 aircraft in 1939, underwent a transformation so dramatic that by the middle of the war, it was completing more than 800 fighters every month. This extraordinary growth from a single company surpassed Germany's entire increase in aircraft production over the same period. One of Republic's most important facilities, the Evansville plant, built on empty ground in 1942, grew into a bustling industrial complex employing 28,000 men and women at peak volume. Roughly 2 out of every 5 workers were female, many of whom had never set foot in a factory before the war. Yet, despite their inexperience, these crews assembled fighters so mechanically reliable that non-combat losses remained extremely rare throughout the conflict. Each Thunderbolt contained over 300,000 rivets, installed using pneumatic tools largely unavailable in German workshops. American assembly lines could complete major components in the span of a single shift, while German factories often required several days for the same tasks. These differences in production rhythm translated directly into overwhelming numerical strength in the skies over Europe. A similar pattern appeared in ammunition logistics. Beyond the 6.5 billion rounds delivered by the Lake City plant, enormous quantities were turned out in manufacturing centers in St. Louis, Denver, and Salt Lake City. Because supply was never in doubt, P-47 pilots entered combat without the constant worry about ammunition conservation that burdened their German adversaries. The U.S. supply network functioned like a global conveyor system, pushing munitions to every theater. Forward airstrips in France often received daily shipments greater than what entire German fighter wings received in a month. As a result, American pilots routinely launched with full ammunition loads, while German units increasingly flew with reduced armament simply because full loads were no longer sustainable. Pilot training revealed another profound imbalance. By 1944, the United States was graduating roughly 100,000 pilots every year, supported by expansive programs tailored specifically for P-47 operations. A new Thunderbolt pilot typically reached the front with more than 200 hours in the air, over 50 of them in the P-47 itself. Germany's training system, under severe fuel shortages and constant pressure, deteriorated from pre-war standards of around 250 flight hours to fewer than 50. Many late-war German pilots fired their aircraft's guns for the first time during actual combat missions. This combination, well-trained American pilots, a durable and heavily armed aircraft, and a supply chain operating on a different scale, meant that engagements often felt one-sided. Encounters that should have been evenly matched battles frequently turned into lethal ambushes in which German pilots were simply outgunned and underprepared. The influence of the P-47 did not end with wartime numbers. Its 8-gun philosophy left a deep mark on U.S. military doctrine in the decades following the conflict. American planners absorbed the lesson that overwhelming firepower, made possible through industrial capacity, could outperform precision-focused tactics. Former German officers who later served within NATO repeatedly emphasized the same point. Their experience against the Thunderbolt convinced them that modern warfare would be decided not by individual heroism, but by the ability to mass-produce lethal technologies.
Survival statistics underlined this disparity. U.S. P-47 pilots who completed their operational tours enjoyed survival rates approaching 90%. German fighter pilots confronting Thunderbolts during 1944–45 faced survival odds below 30%. These numbers did not reflect differences in bravery. They illustrated the mathematical consequences of confronting an opponent whose firepower, training pipeline, and industrial base operated on an entirely different level. Young German airmen, many of whom had logged barely 10 hours in frontline fighters, found themselves confronting American aviators who carried the experience of hundreds of combat missions. These U.S. pilots flew machines armed with 8 heavy Browning 50 caliber guns, a level of firepower that left little room for chance. What unfolded in the skies was determined less by pilot talent and far more by the sheer weight of industrial production behind each aircraft. The Luftwaffe's fighter arm wasn't simply outfought, it was systematically ground down. The Thunderbolt's influence went beyond tallying aerial victories. By helping secure Allied domination of European airspace,
the P-47 became an indispensable tool in the destruction of Germany's war economy. Its presence ensured that American bombers could repeatedly strike factories, fuel plants, and transport hubs. When those raids wiped out synthetic fuel production, the Luftwaffe's remaining strength collapsed under the weight of its own shortages. Even more transformative was the P-47's role in ground attack operations. Thunderbolts roamed over German supply routes, turning daylight travel into a deadly gamble. Columns of vehicles, troop movements, and logistical convoys were forced to halt or move only under cover of darkness. This paralysis fundamentally reshaped Germany's operational options long before many ground commanders fully realized the scale of the crisis. During the Normandy campaign, this air pressure proved decisive. German units attempting to reinforce the front were repeatedly broken apart or delayed because P-47s dominated the skies over France. The inability to move without attracting a hail of machine gun fire meant the German counterattacks arrived late, under strength, or not at all. In the German military community after the war, the P-47 became a symbol of overwhelming American industrial capability. Veterans coined expressions like Thunderbolt mentality to describe the use of massive, relentless force. Military instructors emphasized that future German forces could no longer rely on tactical craftsmanship alone. Matching an opponent's industrial output was now just as vital as battlefield skill. The phrase 8 guns entered the vocabulary as shorthand for an enemy whose firepower exceeded anything Germany could reasonably counter. Staff officers analyzing the conflict concluded that the classical model of warfare, rooted in generalship, precision, and small unit brilliance, had been overtaken by an era in which factories, supply chains, and mass production determined the winner. The Thunderbolt, more than any individual aircraft, illustrated this shift. German pilots who first encountered its wall of .50 caliber bullets were shocked, yet their astonishment reflected a broader misconception. They had trained to believe that superior skill or technological refinement could overcome numerical or material disadvantage. But each engagement with the P-47 delivered the same harsh lesson. The industrial strength of a democratic superpower could convert warfare from a contest of personal prowess into a process driven by production lines. The 8 guns of the Thunderbolt were not merely weapons, they were an expression of a new kind of war, one in which economic scale overshadowed individual heroism. The production run of the P-47 Thunderbolt, 15,686 aircraft fitted with a combined total of 125,488 .50 caliber machine guns and supplied with billions of cartridges, reflected far more than a technical achievement. It showcased an industrial logic that allowed the United States to outfit each fighter with firepower far beyond operational necessity simply because the nation could afford such surplus. For German airmen, this principle became painfully clear. Day after day, they confronted American fighters capable of overwhelming destruction delivered with a kind of mechanical ease. Encounters with the Thunderbolt's 8 heavy machine guns were not merely combat engagements, they were direct lessons in what industrial abundance meant when translated into battlefield realities. The P-47's firepower contributed decisively to Allied control of the skies over Europe, but it also served as a stark demonstration that in a conflict defined by mass production, the side with the larger factories and stronger supply chain held the ultimate advantage. The shock experienced by German pilots when they first encountered Thunderbolts was, at its core, shock at the nature of modern warfare. Many had been trained to expect duels between finely tuned aircraft and masterful flying. What met them instead was a system of war that treated the air battle as a matter of throughput and reliability. The converging streams of tracers, more than 100 rounds per second, represented not only lethal intent, but an industrial rhythm that characterized the American war effort. Within those bright paths of gunfire lay the broader narrative of the Second World War, the capacity of the United States to generate overwhelming material strength and deliver it in any theater it chose. Those German pilots who survived long enough to reflect on their experiences came to understand that they were contending with more than superior fighter design. They were confronting a national approach to production that viewed firepower as a solvable equation rather than a scarce resource. The Thunderbolt, armed with 8.50 caliber guns, became a tangible expression of democratic industry outmatching authoritarian planning, not by ideological contrast, but through sheer numerical capability that rendered individual skill largely irrelevant. Ultimately, the initial disbelief felt by Luftwaffe veterans gave way to recognition. The aircraft that engaged them was not simply a machine of aluminum and steel, it was the physical outcome of a society organized around industrial efficiency. The future of warfare arrived in the form of a fighter that could release torrents of ammunition with unfaltering repetition, each burst a reminder of the industrial power that shaped the conflict and determined its outcome.